Well, hi everyone. I'm Andy Greenberg, and with me is
Carol Greenberg.
And
nice to see you.
Oops, I'm sorry, didn't mean to undercut you, Carol. So today we are going to create history together. History, a very historical event, will occur today as a result of our discussion and your participation and listening. So, are you ready to find out what historical event we are going to do today that generations from now will reflect back and say, the Greenbergs did it?
I'm ready.
All right. We are going to create Jewish Labor Day. It's going to be an official Jewish holiday, and it's going to fall on the first Monday of September, and there'll be special services at synagogue to honor Jewish Labor Day. Carol, what do you think of that?
I think it's a cool idea. I've never heard of it.
No, that's why it's going to be historical. We're doing it right now.
I'm anxious to find out what we're going to do.
And by the way, as you know, these are all unrehearsed. She has no idea what we're going to be talking about.
Not a clue.
And sometimes I don't either. So, why do you think we would create Jewish Labor Day? What kind of a connection do you think there would be between what we know as an American holiday of Labor Day and Judaism?
Well, Jews were slaves.
Yeah.
And so they were free.
Yeah.
So once they were free and they went to work, they needed a break, and it's called Labor Day.
Oh, but we celebrate that for Passover. We cover all that with the matzah and all that.
That was a little far-fetched. Let's see.
Do you know why, by the way? Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I asked them.
I don't know why.
Well, we're going to find out.
Okay.
So what we're going to do, and at the end, I think you're going to agree with me. So let me ask you a question. What is American Labor Day to begin with? I'd like to ask you. I can't. I got to ask her. What is American Labor Day?
Okay. I think that it's supposed to be a day honoring all workers.
Honoring all workers. All right, that's fine. We'll take that. All workers are being honored. And what are they being honored for?
It beats me. It's just we've had Labor Day off as long as I know. I don't know.
Never asked that question. What do we honor these people for? What is it all about? So is it the struggle between management and labor? Is it the struggle that labor won over management and got all these rights to do things that they might not have been able to do had they not organized into
unions?
And
I think I like that. That's probably it. Is that it?
That's one of the reasons. Okay. Yeah, we want to honor it and recognize the fact that without laborers, there wouldn't be an economy. Without an economy, there wouldn't be corporations. Without corporations, there wouldn't be management, and on and on and on. So what does this have to do with Judaism?
I don't know. Let's find out.
Take a guess. Take a wild. No, hardly anybody knows. Take a wild guess. Come on.
I don't know.
Well, here it comes. I'm glad you don't know. Here it comes. Because nearly every right that the unions fought for were basically Jewish. Now, am I making this stuff up? No. How do I know this stuff? Because it's written. Ready for this? What two books do you think they're written in?
Written in the Torah, and it's written in the Talmud.
You mean to tell me that in the Torah and Talmud it says there should be organized workers? They should be able to go on strike and all that kind of stuff? How would these people have... Did you know that? Because now you will. So really the first ever idea of a vacation came in the beginning. Care to guess what that vacation was?
A long time ago?
Yeah, really long time ago. Really long time ago. 5,780 years ago.
When Adam and Eve rested in the garden?
Well, even before Adam and Eve. Listen, folks.
Oh, no.
Go.
God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh day.
There it is. You don't work 7 days a week. If God takes off, we take off. Now, by the way, you might think, okay, that is strictly a Jewish thing. You see, this is true. You can look it up in history books. After the Shabbat was declared by God during the giving of the Ten Commandments, guess what workers did who were not Jewish, and they found out about it throughout the world?
They wanted to have their day of rest too.
Because everybody worked for 7 days. Look it up. Everybody worked for 7 days. As a matter of fact, the very ancient Greeks and the very ancient Romans looked down on labor, and they did not give them the freedom that they were entitled to. And by the way, what's the purpose of work?
The purpose of work is to earn a living.
And what are you supposed to do with that living?
You're supposed to buy things and house yourself and take care of your family and buy the things you want and the necessities you need.
Yeah. And what does all that lead to? The enjoyment of life. Because you work to enjoy life. Yes, food and everything else is all part of it. Now, how do we know that? Because the Talmud says the following: he who enjoys the fruits of his own labor is greater than the man who fears God.
Yes, but there will be people that will argue with you and they say the first point of working is to make a living and then enjoy yourself.
No. See, just to make a living says you survive.
Well, if you need a house to live in and food, you have to make a living.
Yes, but it depends upon what kind of a house you have the vision for. Are you getting a house just for the sake of living into a house, or are you getting a house because of the largeness of it, the items in the house? Are you enjoying it, or you just have to live there? And what Judaism teaches, you get things for the sake of enjoyment. When you work, you're just not making a living. You have a vision of what your lifestyle should be like, and you make enough money to accomplish that.
But not everybody enjoys the job they have.
Well, then they should change jobs.
Not so easy.
Okay. So that's a whole different part. So let's start taking a look at some of the things that are involved in Judaism. Number one, not necessarily in order. The Talmud says that in the olden days, Jews were not business owners. Jews were not the ones who owned the land. They were, in fact, woodcutters, construction workers, tailors, farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, tanners, bakers, and shoemakers. And they worked for other companies, but they had rights under those other companies. Rights which you're about to learn are given to American workers today. And you'll be interested to find out a little bit later how they got there. So, let's begin. When should a person be paid for their work?
Whenever, I don't know, every 2 weeks, once a month.
No. Incorrect. According to Judaism, the Talmud, a person is supposed to get paid the day the work is finished. And you know what they call that? A day laborer.
A day laborer.
So a day laborer is supposed to get paid. Now, if the worker agrees to get paid once every 2 weeks or once a week, that's okay. But the obligation, according to Judaism, is you never withhold wages from a person who is working for you. And you must pay them on a timely basis. And there is absolutely no restriction to that. You absolutely have to pay them when they are due to be paid. And it is very, very important that the following things do not occur, according to the Talmud, which is relatable to today. Here we go. Employers who withhold wages are guilty of what? 6 violations. Number 1, oppressing a neighbor. Why? Because everybody lived in the same neighborhood. Number 2, stealing. What can an employer steal if they don't pay their employees?
They're stealing their wages.
They're stealing their wages. Oppressing the poor. Why? Because if a poor man is working and they don't get paid, what happens?
They don't have any money.
Yes. And payment of wages, failing to pay wages at the due date, and failing to pay wages before sunset. Those are criminal actions. And by the way, if somebody works for a living here in the United States today and they're not paid, there are civil actions, and one can suggest that maybe potentially they could also be criminal. But it was Judaism way back when in the Talmud, while the Greeks and the Romans didn't care much for employee benefits or anything else, which I'll get to, by the way, then they had to be paid right away. And if they did not get paid, guess what the employee had a right to do?
Call authorities.
Call authorities, and when they called the authorities, they had a right to place a lien on the employee who did not pay them.
Employer,
Employer who did not pay them. How about that?
How about that?
So the wages to be paid on time for a full day must be. Now, what about this? Do you have to pay somebody in money, or can you do exchanges? Is it money or exchanges?
You can do exchanges. You can borrow. No, you have to pay them in money.
You have to pay them in currency.
What if they agree to do something?
You're not even supposed to be able to agree, because that could be something called coercion. Okay, so you got to pay them money. Why money?
So they can buy the things and buy the food.
Whatever they want.
Whatever.
You can't say, I'm going to give you this for that. No. So there's no bartering. By the way, in American labor law today, I don't know if any of us or you have been labor lawyers, but can you give somebody a grocery bill, a grocery gift card to buy groceries, or do you have to give them money? The answer is money.
Okay.
You have to give them money. That's step one. Step two. You know, in the unions and in America, there's such a thing called the right to work. What is a right to work? A right to work says the principle at stake is that a free worker may not be enslaved, and since the contracting of labor involves a temporary surrender of independence, day laborers may assert their independence at any time by quitting. So what does that mean?
I don't know.
You can walk off the job. Wow. Wait a minute.
Because you belong to a union.
Well, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. Okay? Forget about the union for a moment. We're going to get there. But if you walk off the job because you are not happy with the employer, thank you for that, what do we call that in modern day times?
Harassment?
No, a strike.
A what?
A strike.
A strike, okay.
A strike. And by the way, do you get paid when you're on strike?
Yes.
Yes. Not only that, watch this. You know medical benefits that people get today, what do you call it, sick leave. Where do you think that idea came from? These are rhetorical questions, by the way. Where do you think that came from?
That.
Yeah, that. Okay, known as a Talmud. Now you're beginning to see why I'm saying we should call this Jewish Labor Day, because it says, if there were mitigating circumstances such as illness or death of a relative, what do we call that? Grievance? Bereavement, thank you. A worker who quit, listen to this, must be paid, even if they cause an irreversible loss to the employer. So the whole modern, bet you didn't know this, the whole modern thing about paying somebody when they're grieving, about paying for illness on sick leave, is not new. It has been part of Jewish thought and law, which in the 1920s and 30s was adopted. I'll get to that a little bit later, which was adopted by America. Prior to that, guess what? No. Ooh, just to give you a clue, who do you think developed and was responsible for the new labor unions to be developed in the United States?
I don't know.
Jews. And we will get to that. So, what happens if somebody's laid off? You didn't know the Talmud covers this stuff, did you? What happens if somebody gets laid off? If they get laid off, and in effect they find a lower paying job, they can demand the difference in wages from the first employer. So what does that mean?
That's all new to me. I never heard
Well, that's why we're going to create Jewish Labor Day. This is the point. So what do we call that today? We call that severance pay. So you pay in advance. Usually when people get laid off or you go to a job, you get severance pay. And that's where those ideas came from, all the way back. Now you might be wondering, where did this whole idea of labor unions come from? Well, by now you must know the answer. It does come from the Talmud, because they do talk about the Talmud's prohibition on the retraction of contracts by employers provided a measure of protection against arbitrary dismissal. And arbitrary dismissal was part of the negotiation collective bargaining process. All part of unions. Let's go on to another one. How many hours a day can a person work?
8.
8. And what happens after 8?
They get overtime.
Aha! Well, why can't they work 12 hours at straight pay?
The unions probably declared they cannot work more than 8 hours.
And where do you think?
And they must have a lunch break.
We're going to get to that. Thank you very much. And how do they get the idea about this whole issue of limits on work? Aha, here it comes. It says in the Talmud, it requires workers to be paid for hours spent walking to work. Yes.
Walking to
Yeah,
work?
but not coming home. And they do limit the number of hours that they have to work. Why? Very simple. Remember I went back earlier and I said, what's the purpose of work? To enjoy life?
Oh, so they could go home and enjoy their life.
So they can go home and enjoy life. There is a law that says if you are a day worker, you must be able to go home at sunset. And there's a law that prohibits a worker from working at night unless the job requires it. How about that?
How about that?
Anything of that is overtime. Let me go even further. Now, you said it earlier, the right to eat. Yeah. Now, you know as well as I do that way back when prior to the 1900s, you didn't have, as a worker, have a right to eat. You'd starve. But you know what? There's an interesting thing in the Torah. Very interesting thing. Let's assume, for example, you and I are farmers back in the time of the Torah. And we got this ox. And the ox is doing a great job in towing the cart behind us and taking the stuff to market. But you know what? The ox gets hungry. So the ox stops. And the ox starts to do what? Eat. Are you allowed to kick the ox or whip the ox and make the ox go further? Or without eating? Another way to phrase it, I think many of us might have gone horseback riding. And what happens when you go horseback riding, all of a sudden the horsey stops, and what does he do?
He stops to eat.
He stops to eat. And what do we do when the horsey stops to eat?
We kick.
We kick it. You fool, I paid money. Get on with this. Stop eating. Go eat on your own time. Jewish law says no.
No. But the reason sometimes you don't kick it, you nudge the horse so the horse will go faster.
And the horse really likes to be nudged. Oh yeah, I like. You know, if you're having a meal, right? You're enjoying something that you cook. You like that? Get on with it. Boom. Hurry up. Boom. I got someplace to go.
No, then I guess it's cruelty to animals. You shouldn't be doing it because it's cruel to animals.
Right. Exactly right. So the Jewish law said, wait a minute, if an animal has a right to stop to eat, guess who else has a right to stop to eat?
Waiters.
The workers, anytime they have lunch hour and breaks. But, listen to this. You never believe all this stuff. Listen to this. Waiters. Are waiters allowed to eat the food that the restaurant sells to other customers?
After hours, yes. If it's left over. After the restaurant has done their business and it's left over, why wouldn't they be able to eat the food?
So what you're saying is, in a restaurant, say for example, they prepare dishes earlier in the day, and at the end of the day, they're not as good because they're leftovers. So you give the slop to the waiters.
Well, I wouldn't call it slop.
It's not as good. That's what leftovers are.
Okay.
Not yours.
So wait. So my leftovers.
I said not yours. So according to the Torah and the Talmud, waiters are permitted to eat some of the food that they serve.
They are.
Yes, and that's where that law came in from. You see, these are things you probably never knew. And that's why I'm talking about establishing Jewish Labor Day. Because guess what?
What?
You can't have Labor Day without Jews. It wouldn't be. Oh, wait a minute. You might say, but Andy, other books have had all this stuff. You'd be incorrect.
What?
Other books and societies have had this stuff. You'd be incorrect. We're the ones that started it. I'm not saying we should boast. I'm not saying we should be proud of it, but at least we should know that a lot of what's happening in society today, take rituals aside and religion aside for just a moment, but just talk about Judaism as its contribution to the world, this is a fantastic thing. Is it not?
It's interesting, yeah.
Okay, here we go. We talked a little bit about sick and disability pay, but we are entitled to sick and disability pay. Why? The Talmud says as follows. If somebody is working and they're carrying something very heavy on their shoulder, that is too heavy, and all of a sudden it injures them, who pays?
The employer.
What do you call that today?
Disability.
Yeah, workman's compensation.
Yeah, workman's compensation.
We even developed workman's compensation. How about that? Now, the Talmud also says that temple priests, you know these guys, the priests in the temples, they used to get the food, and that were given for the karban, for the sacrifices. They got 10% of it to eat before it went to the actual altar. Well, you know what? Once in a while, it wasn't so good. They got intestinal infections. And guess who had to pay for their medical bills?
The people who gave them the food.
That's exactly right. Not only that, the temple itself, their employer had to set aside money for workman's compensation for the high priests in case they got ill with the food. What do you think about that? Did you know all that stuff? Did you know all that stuff? It's so interesting, I think. All right, let's continue on and see what else we can talk about here. Now, what are the obligations of the employee?
What are the
Yeah, what do you think the obligations of the employee is? I mean, it's a two-way street.
Employee.
Yeah, the worker.
To show up on time.
Yeah.
To not show up on time. To show up. To not be absent.
Okay, good.
To put in a good amount of work.
Good.
To be respectful to the people that he works with.
Okay, like to see that happen one day.
All right.
All right. Well, that's what you got it there. Plus one more. Day laborers, the ones that work with the strength, are required to work faithfully. That's basically a synopsis of what you said. With all of their strength. And to refrain from weakening themselves by going hungry or working both days and nights. Or by showing up drunk. So what does that mean, days and nights? Let's say, God forbid, somebody needs to have two jobs. You need two jobs because your standard of living requires you to have, your chosen standard of living requires you to have two jobs. Now, if second job impacts the way you perform your first job, or your first job impacts the way you perform your second job, guess what? You are violating Jewish laws. What do you think about that?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that it doesn't go on. That doesn't mean that people don't do that.
Yes. Well, they do. I understand that. Now,
so one job suffers more than the other.
Right. But here's another interesting law. Let's say, for example, you're on a manufacturing line, and you're manufacturing something, but you ruin the product. You ruin the product. Who's responsible for the ruining of the product?
I think it's you.
Yeah. I'm responsible for that.
You have to pay for it.
I have to pay for it.
It comes out of your wages.
Comes out of my wages. And in some instances, that law still exists, in some instances, here in the United States, where if you come to work and you make a mistake and the products are ruined and you ruin the reputation, number one, you get fired, which is the same thing for being held responsible. So that's why when you come to work, you got to have everything around you and everything having the ability.
And even if you do have everything around you and all your energy, mistakes do happen. Mm-hmm. So if somebody happened to make a mistake and it wasn't intentional, of course, just they're going to get fired over the one thing that they did.
Right.
One thing.
Yep. No. Yes, the one thing. Yeah, because it might have been something very, very serious. It could be. Now, that might be to the extreme, but that's the way it is. All right, let's move on. So we talked about the forming of trade unions, which is known, of course, as unions today, which is what Labor Day is all about. What a unique idea. Woo! Boy, that's fantastic. Except it came from the Talmud. It is clear, it is written, that worker organizations existed during the period in which the Talmud was codified, which is about a little over 2,000 years ago. The Talmud refers to a separate synagogue for coppersmiths, a separate seating in temple for different types of workers, and to efforts by workers to engage in mutual self-help. So, this might be a stretch.
So you're saying that there was a caste system back then?
Yes. Goldsmiths sat separately, silversmiths sat separately, blacksmiths sat separately, etc., etc. Doesn't mean that one was better than the other. I'm not going to say that.
Isn't that a form of racism?
I don't believe so, unless they decided to sit together, which is what the case was. Since they decided to sit together in the temple, there is a stretch, and I'll go with the word stretch, that was the original concept of like workers with like skills organizing. Because they weren't told to sit there, they said, let's all sit together. Let's go on. Moreover, the Talmud explicitly recognized the right of worker organizations to regulate wages and to make binding rules and regulations on members of the association. How about that? So the labor unions were there at the time. And here's the words that they use. This is important. I'm reading a lot of this stuff. I normally don't, but it's a lot to remember. According to a commentator in the Talmud, the wool weavers and dyers have the power to say, any order which comes to town, all of us will share in it. Now that might sound a little bit like socialism. I'll get to that a little bit later. The bakers have the right to make agreements on weight and measures among themselves. The shipmasters have the right to declare, listen to this, whoever is lost, we shall provide him with another ship. And they take that as by saying we have the right to have labor unions. The Talmud goes on to say that the right to establish work rules and require compliance by members has already been noted, which means if you're part of a union, you got to follow the rules. The right to distribute available work through hiring halls. By the way, isn't that what happens in today's unions? They have the hiring halls? Yeah, all here in the Talmud. They have the right to engage in collective bargaining. Yes, the Talmud implicitly recognizes the right of the trade unions to strike, although, as noted before, there is a strong preference for binding arbitration. There was a strike in the Talmud.
Oh.
They just don't tell stories and make laws. There are actual instances of history. This is nuts. Listen to this. In what certainly was one of the first strikes in history, the Talmud describes job actions by craftspeople associated with the temple. And there was a society of bakers that stopped baking bread for Friday night rituals because they weren't paid enough. And they demanded as a union for their pay to double, and they actually stopped making challah for the Jewish people.
So did they get paid double?
Yeah, they got paid double. They absolutely did. They got paid double.
But that was also very, very important.
Yes.
I mean, people needed their bread, they needed their challah, they needed this and that.
Right. So, Carol, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor, and that is to please go to the wall and turn the big light on because we're losing a little bit of light here, and I should have done this earlier, but I didn't do it. And then when Carol comes back, I'm going to ask her a very important question. Welcome back, Carol.
Thank you. Good to be back.
So my question is, have I stretched things, or is this reality? Well, is Labor Day Jewish Day or not? There's more coming, by the way.
No, you haven't stretched things. It's reality. You found it as proof in the Talmud and the Torah. Mm-hmm.
So let's go back to the old days, and let's bring it back to the new days. There is a story of a Rabbi Feinstein recently, and Rabbi Feinstein ruled in a case involving teachers at a Jewish day school that strikers are entitled to be paid for the days that they are engaged in a legal under Jewish law strike. Clearly, the practice of permanently replacing workers who exercise their right to strike also falls within the Talmudic prohibition. So what does that mean? Does everybody remember Ronald Reagan when the air traffic controllers went on strike? And what did the air traffic controllers, what did Ronald Reagan say? Let them go on strike. I got it. They're all fired, and I'm bringing in new people. He did that. Look it up in history.
I believe you.
If Ronald Reagan was Jewish, he would have been prohibited from taking that action. In other words, the Talmud says if you go out on strike, and I think the law was changed after that, if I remember correct, the Talmud prohibits you from doing that. So all these things that we're talking about, every one of these things that we're celebrating Labor Day for, labor unions and the whole 9 yards, go back to original Judaism. But now, that's fine. Let's talk about modern times. How did these unions get developed? Who developed the unions that we're so familiar with? Well, let's go back 3 generations ago. There was a fellow by the name of Samuel Gompers, Gompers, a Jewish immigrant. And what was his job? A cigar maker. That's what he did. Nice job. Nothing wrong with it. My dad was a tobacconist, and he moved from rolling tobacco leaves to organizing workers, developing the concept of collective bargaining, and he became the president. Anybody want to take a guess of what he became president of?
Some big union.
Yeah, absolutely. The American Federation of Labor.
Wow.
AFL, American Federation of Labor. At the same time, there was a lady by the name of Clara Lemlich. Who was she? A young Jewish seamstress. And she worked in a sweatshop. Yes. And she came to the attention of the outside world at a mass meeting held at the Copper Union in November 22nd, 1909. And she wanted to rally support for the striking shirtwaist workers. And she went up to the platform, this little Jewish immigrant, and said the following. She said, when she addressed the workers in Yiddish, I don't know Yiddish. If you guys want to translate that, that's fine. I don't do it. She said, enough talk, and called for an immediate walkout in support of those already on strike. So what's the big deal? A little strike. Who cares? But she got a lot of notoriety. And as a result of her, there were 20,000 of 32,000 workers in the shirtwaist trade that walked out in the next 2 days. And as a result of that, a very popular union was developed. And I think everybody knows the name of this union. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union.
And that's all because of her?
That's all because of her.
Wow.
Now, regrettably, or ironically, March 25th of 1911, there was a big fire. 150 garment workers died in that fire, and that changed a whole bunch of stuff.
Wow.
And she survived, although her cousin died. Now, here's the most interesting thing about Clara, I think. See if you agree. She lived to 95 years old. And at 95 years old, she, in fact, lived in a retirement home. And in the retirement home, there were janitors. And guess what? 95-year-old.
Organized a union for the janitors.
She organized the union for the janitors to demand a better contract.
Did they get it?
Yeah, they got it. You imagine that? Can you imagine that? And she got all this stuff from way back when. So what's the history of it? There were Eastern European Jews who arrived in the United States and at the time of unrestrained American capitalism. And what happened during the unrestrained American capitalism? Who did they take advantage of? The workers. You bet. They took advantage of the workers. And when the Jews came over, your ancestors, by the way, when the Jews, and mine, when the Jews came over, did they have businesses? Did they own the department stores? Did they do all the stuff they do today? No. They went right into working. That's what they did, the work. And there was a fellow by the name of Bernard Weinstein. He was a 19-year-old shirt maker and a recent Bundist, B-U-N-D-I-S-T, which is a part of socialist Germany, if you remember correctly. And he was activist in Russia. And he began to develop the United Hebrew Trades. And he organized all the Jewish people into 22 different unions. Topography Union, Shirt Makers Union, Knee Pants Makers Union, never heard of that one, Cloak Makers, Cap Makers Union, Bakers Union, and yes, believe it or not, a Yiddish Actors Union. And they were so prominent that they were able to get rules and regulations for the Jewish people all built up. And I want to go back to 1905. There was a fellow by the name of Abraham Bisno, a deputy inspector of factories for the state of Illinois. And he suggested in a report on Chicago men's clothing industry, here we go, that most of the Jewish factory workers do not believe themselves to be working men for life. Nor do they think they will leave a heritage to their children, the lot of a wage worker. In plain English,
It means that they were destined for something better.
They were destined for something better. That's exactly what it means. And so way back when, in those days, the whole thing started where we took a look at the unions. Now the question is, when we came over, why did we work so hard?
So we could get money to do the things we wanted to do.
Yes. We went to the Lower East Side. We did all those jobs because we wanted our kids and ourselves to get educated so we could eventually move out to the suburbs. Now I'm going to get a little bit controversial. In the world today, politics, and I don't talk politics, there is a big dialogue about socialism and way back when about communism. The Jews who organized labor unions were in fact socialists. They belonged to what's known as the Socialist Labor Party. Many of them were registered or unregistered communists. And as a result of their work to give workers the right to do things, as socialists and as communists, they changed the structure of American economics by forming the unions and by getting workers the rights that they were entitled to under Jewish law here in the United States. I'm going to pause. What do you think so far?
So do we still have big unions like that? I know there's the teachers union, so I know there's the auto workers union. So are unions still prevalent?
Yes. Are they as powerful as they used to be? No.
Why?
Well, there's a double-edged sword. So part of the double-edged sword says because management took over, the wages were too high, and work was shifted overseas to China and to Mexico because they didn't have the strength of the labor unions and they didn't have the high wages and they made things cheaper, and Americans wanted to save money, so they bought those products. You all know the story. Factories got closed down and the unions lost their power. That's a nice story. It happens to be true. The other part of the story is, as a result of McCarthyism, remember McCarthyism?
Yes, they were blacklisted because they were thought to be communists.
Yes, the very same people that formed the labor unions to give the labor unions the rights and demands that they went after for their workers and members, according to the Talmud, were Jewish, and then all of a sudden, because the Jews were blacklisted, they were no longer allowed to have the positions of power within those organizations. So, there's two ways to answer that question. One, they became too powerful, or two, and I'm not saying this one's right, but some people might, two, the Jews were no longer running the event. Or a combination of both, or neither. So there was this fella by the name of Daniel de Leon, and he was a Sephardic Jew, and he organized the Socialist Labor Party in the United States. And he had 25 different Yiddish-speaking branches, and over 30% of all the Jewish vote at the time of elections went to the people of the Jewish people who belonged to the Socialist Labor Party.
Is that still in existence?
No. No. Socialist Labor Party is not in existence today. But the Jews, like de Leon, really were exceptionally part of all of it. As a matter of fact, they had a newspaper. Some of you might know the name of this. It's called Forverts, Forverts. And it was called The Workers of the World Unite. And it was, in fact, a Yiddish communist newspaper, I should say, that was developed in the 1920s and was so popular. As a result of the Jews and the Socialist Party, and something that they called social unionism, here's what developed. Health clinics, sanatoriums for tuberculosis, pensions, daycare centers, vacation resorts and summer camps. I'm going to pause. Your mom worked for?
IBM.
And what did IBM have out in Long Island?
Country club.
A country club. For who?
For their workers.
Yeah, that could be actually traced back to social unionism.
Wow.
Because social unionism had these areas. Education and lectures, cultural activities, Banks, there's one social bank apparently that still exists. So all of these were Jewish ideas that were prevalent in the United States. And moving even forward, there was a fellow by the name of Schneiderman in 1912. She wrote the following, yes, said the following about women workers. Listen to this, women workers. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. And that's where the phrase bread and roses came from. And what was that all about? And that was about stop oppressing women workers. Because in those days, and we know the history of the United States, in those days, women workers were what? They were oppressed. And not only that, let's go back to the 1960s. The children of these radical Jewish workers, the ones that I'm talking about, the socialists and the whole 9 yards. Now, I don't know if you want to call them radical or not. I probably use that word because it was used to describe them. I'm not saying that's the way I describe them, so I want to make sure that that's understood. The children of these radical Jewish workers flocked to public colleges in higher numbers than any other ethnic group. And do you remember what the phrase was in the 1960s and the 1970s? It was called the New Left. And what were they made out of? They fought in the 60s and 70s for civil rights, which is a Jewish theme, feminist and gay liberation movements. And that's where we are.
So a lot of good has come out of the socialist idea.
It depends who you talk to. It depends who you talk to. But apparently so, because what does America celebrate the first Monday of every year?
Labor Day.
Labor Day. So just a little bit more facts. A small CIO union called the Local 1119 was led by Jewish communist Leon Davis, who organized the mostly Jewish pharmacists and other drugstore employees in New York City during the Depression. In 1950s, it branched out into organizing black and Puerto Rican hospital workers and achieved success by engaging in very militant strikes. And of course, the most famous strike of all in New York teaching was led by the Teachers Union and Albert Shankman, if we remember him, for those who were from New York, and he changed the whole thing. Historically, unions led by Jewish socialists. There was a fellow by the name of A. Philip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. I'm going to end with this one. And a leading campaigner against employment discrimination, had ties to the Socialist Party and its many Jewish activities. In the civil rights struggles of the late 1940s, Jewish communists stood out in their tireless efforts to do what? What do you think? Integrate baseball. Now, you asked me when this whole thing stopped. It stopped after World War II in terms of Jewish and labor unions. And why is that? Because that's when the Jews began to prosper. That's when they went from workers into management. That's when they went into entrepreneurs. That's when they went into professions. And for that reason, they all changed. So there's a lot more that is in there. There's one other lady who made a great comment. Her name was Myra Wolfgang. She was secretary-treasurer of the Detroit Joint Executive Board of Hotel and Restaurant Employees. That's a long one to say. And Bartenders International Union in Detroit. And she brought 3,000 delegates up and she said, you call Mr. George Meany, who was head of the AFL-CIO, and tell him that there are 3,000 women in Chicago and they didn't come here to swap recipes. And one of the strikes against Woolworth was organized by the Jews. So I started out this whole discussion talking about, hey, let's call it American Labor Day, Jewish Labor Day. Carol, what do you think?
I think it was very interesting. I learned a lot of things. I learned I learned the history of it, and that a lot of stuff came from the Talmud. It was very interesting.
Yeah, a lot of stuff came from the Talmud, a lot of stuff came from the Torah. So I ask you this question. What would happen to American workers today if there was no Talmud and there was no Torah? What would happen if God did not say take one day off? What would the state of world labor and American labor be in today? What would the state of happiness be in terms of family, in terms of understanding why we work, in terms of understanding what we do with our money? Where would medical insurance be? Where would pensions be? Where would time off be? And everything else. Now, some people will come back and justifiably say, well, somebody would have done it afterwards. I got that. I understand that. But isn't it interesting that nobody did it before? So how can we say that nobody would do it after if nobody did it before? Help me understand that argument, Carol. Can't, can we? So I think we can relatively agree, or not, that this whole thing about labor rights and the whole 9 yards is directly related to Judaism. And here's another question that you might want to ask yourself. If you take a look at other countries who do not have the same union rules that we do, or the right to work rules, or workers' right rules, ask yourself this question. Interesting one. How many Jews live in those countries? And if you take a look at the countries that have laws that protect the workers, maybe not necessarily labor unions, but other ways within the government, ask yourself this. How many of those countries have had, in fact, a Jewish influence? And you'll find, with exception, but the evidence is overwhelming, that those countries that protect their workers and provide them with a decent wage and provide them with the protection have in fact had a Jewish influence either in the past or current, and those that haven't had that and those that have do have the rules and regulations in place to protect workers. And as a matter of fact, there's an interesting kosher law about kosher grapes and wine. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, and that is as follows. Wine is not kosher for a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons is that if it is determined, Carol, that the grape picker was abused by the employer at the time that they're picking the grapes,
then it's not kosher?
It's not kosher.
Wow.
And it goes all the way back to that area. It goes all the way back to that. This is in this era, by the way. I'm not talking about ancient times. So, Carol and I certainly hope that you have learned something about Labor Day, and whether it's Jewish Labor Day or not Jewish Labor Day, it is a day to honor our American workers for all the contributions that they have given. My name is Andy Greenberg. This is
Carol Greenberg.
And we, again, hope that you enjoyed this so much. It was our pleasure to put it together for you. Take care. We'll see you next time with another interesting discussion about Jewish culture and about Judaism. Take care. Shalom.